It's the Whisky Wizard!
Hello and welcome to the Whisky Wizard, where we say that whiskey making takes scientific knowledge, an artisan's skill and dedication, and a bit of the wizard's alchemy of light, air, earth, and fire. Earlier this year, I was out on the West Coast, and one evening I was enjoying a dram with my son Cameron and his girlfriend Lauren Slater, when we started discussing some potential future Whisky Wizard episodes. During this discussion, Lauren said that if it were possible, she'd love to have them contribute to an episode on Dr. Bill Lumsden, the mad scientist of single malt whiskey. I was intrigued and, of course, quite enthusiastic about the idea. So I'll simply say, take it away, Lauren and Cameron.
Hello, I'm Lauren Slater, and welcome to another guest episode of the Whisky Wizard from Los Angeles, California. This year, the Whisky Roundtable is featuring the wonderful port-finished Quinta Ruban from Glenmorangie, which gives me an excuse to talk about somebody who I'm a huge fan of, and that is Dr. Bill Lumsden of Glenmorangie and Ardbeg. Dr. Bill Lumsden is known as the Willy Wonka of whiskey and the mad scientist of Tain, and for good reason. He's responsible for some of the most important innovations in Scotch whiskey today, and some of my favorite aspects of the world of Scotch whiskey that have been true for the entire time I've been a drinking adult wouldn't be so commonplace if it hadn't been for this man's career. So we have him to thank for a lot of fantastic Scotch whiskeys out there. He's one of the most important innovators in the world of whiskey today, and I hope you'll be as excited to learn about him as I was. Dr. Bill Lumsden is the master of distilling, whiskey creation, and whiskey stocks for Glenmorangie and Ardbeg distilleries. He's one of the most decorated and highly awarded whiskey makers in the world at this point. And he has a PhD in biochemistry and has been working in whiskey ever since he graduated from college. He's an expert in the flavors that wood imparts into the spirit, as well as aging and maturation, and the minor fine details of chemistry and how they impart the flavors of the whiskey. So to understand the importance of Dr. Bill's career on the Scotch whiskey world, you'll need to understand a little bit of history. Sherry barrels and Scotch whiskey are absolutely nothing new. In fact, before American bourbon barrels started getting shipped to Scotland in the 1940s, almost all Scotch whiskey was aged entirely in sherry barrels for its entire life. But starting in the 1990s, when Dr. Bill Lumsden was working at Glenmorangie, he was working with a very, very delicately flavored whiskey in Glenmorangie 10 and wanted to impart some of the flavors associated with sherry and port to this whiskey, but he knew from his background in chemistry that aging it and maturing it entirely in a sherry barrel would overwhelm the flavor in the whiskey, and you'd completely lose the delicate floral character that Glenmorangie is known for. So what he did was take whiskey that had originally been aged in bourbon barrels and finish it for 18 months about in sherry casks or port casks or other wine casks. And he did a lot of experimentation with different barrels, figuring out what worked the best. And he was actually the first to do this on a large scale. Nowadays, when you think of Scotch whiskeys that are finished in other barrels, it's so common that you don't even think of it as a special thing. But it really did start at Glenmorangie. And those firsts didn't stop coming. He was the first one to do a PX sherry finish in 2010. He's been playing around with different yeasts with an experimentation from the private edition, the Alta, in 2019. It used a wild yeast from the distillery grounds itself, from the Cadball estate around Glenmorangie, that was isolated in his own labs, and he distilled a whiskey using this special yeast that no one else is using. But he didn't stop there. Both Glenmorangie and Ardbeg release private editions every year, and almost all of these are an interesting experiment with the wood that the whiskey is aged in, or a fantastic choice of finish. The Ardbeg drum is finished in rum casks, and that being a peaty, heavy, strong whiskey, the sugar cane and caramel flavors that come from that rum are absolutely amazing. If you like Islay Scotch and you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it. In more recent years, he's also done some other incredibly creative things with wood. In 2018, the Glenmorangie private edition was the Speos, which was matured entirely in ex-rye casks and brought a bright spiciness that we associate with rye to the forefront of an otherwise very aromatic and fragrant whiskey. There was also, the year before, the Bacalta, Gaelic for baked, was a Madeira cask finish. This was actually a bit of a continuation from a prior experiment. Dr. Bill had released some Madeira cask finished Glenmorangie in the past, almost a decade before, but it had to be discontinued because he couldn't secure a consistent source of Madeira cask barrels. The island of Madeira is very small, and Madeira wine, the industry is a bit mercurial, and though this sweet wine is highly prized around the world, it is made in very, very small batches. So for the Bacalta, he actually had a cooperage in Scotland make high grain density barrels specifically for this tropical region, and had them sent to Madeira, worked with a winery there to have the barrels for this soaking in the upper rafters of their aging house, where they would get warmer than usual and have even more of the wine soak into the wood than usual, so that when they were finally used to make the whiskey, even more of that sweetness and warmth would make its way into the final spirit. I have no idea what effect it had on the wine, but clearly the product, the whole thing was designed for the whiskey that would be made at the end. But he doesn't just experiment with wood finishes. The Glenmorangie Alta was a departure from tradition in an entirely different area with the yeast. For this one, Dr. Bill Lumsden took some barley that was growing on the Cadball estate and isolated several of the naturally growing wild yeast strains that were living on the barley itself, and isolated those strains and made a batch of whiskey with each one. He selected the best one and used that to create the Glenmorangie Alta. It's, other than the very surprising yeast, it's a very simple whiskey, very similar to the Glenmorangie 10. It has some more biscuity and bready flavors than the Glenmorangie 10 does. The Alta is also finished in ex-bourbon barrels, and it's otherwise a very simple spirit with no interesting finishes to let you taste as much as you can the flavors brought by the yeast, rather than focusing entirely on a wood finish. And I think it's really amazing because there's no other whiskey in the world that is like it. I love that desire to constantly find new things and new ways of finding a better flavor or a newer flavor or something that hasn't been done before. When Dr. Bill Lumsden started working at Glenmorangie, he had a list of different barrels and casks that he wanted to eventually try to finish Glenmorangie whiskey in. And he didn't expect to get everything on his list. In fact, he probably didn't expect to get much of anything from his list. But on that list were two of the most expensive wines in the entire world, including the Romani Conti, which is a chateau in Burgundy. And he ended up getting them. Apparently the owner of these two chateaus was a huge fan of Scotch whiskey and was very excited when he heard about this plan. The Glenmorangie Pride was released, I believe, in the late 90s. I haven't tried it, but it was a marriage of whiskey aged in these two very, very, very prestigious wine casks. And wine casks are typically used for generations. So this is something very, very special. Only 1,000 bottles were made. And I think it sold for $3,000 retail when it came out. But it's, again, one of the most creative whiskeys ever made at the time. And a huge risk, too. The reason why Dr. Bill Lumsden is probably my favorite person in the world of whiskey is that throughout his entire career, he has continued asking questions of, what if I tried this? What would it taste like if I tried this? What would it taste like if we tried this? And to see somebody coming from a position of his level of knowledge and experience, who never loses that curiosity, who never loses that desire to, oh, well, I learned this, so now I want to know what would happen if I do that. That kind of excitement is something you don't see very often. And when you see something like that applied to an art like whiskey making, you'll just get win after win after win. There might be some losses in there, but those don't get bottled and sold to everyone. Without that desire to know what would happen if I tried, you'll never make anything new. You'll only be able to make slightly better versions of what was made when you came to the distillery. And so many of Dr. Bill Lumsden's interesting experiments led to things that are now thought of as completely traditional and normal ways of making whiskey. This is an Amontillado finish. I forgot to talk about this one that's on my table. I love it. It's really good. So many of the innovations that started out as experiments in Dr. Bill Lumsden's lighthouse lab have now become accepted parts of the whiskey tradition in Scotland. Nowadays, it's really unsurprising to see a whiskey that's finished in a dessert wine cask, or finished in sherry, or matured in one thing and finished in another. And so many of those whiskeys are absolutely amazing. By the time I reached the age of drinking whiskey, that was already how the world of Scotch looked. But it wouldn't if it hadn't been for his career. And I am so impressed that rather than just resting on an achievement like that, he continues to ask, what could I possibly do to make a better whiskey? I hope you've enjoyed hearing about one of my favorite whiskey makers in the world. If you want to know more about Dr. Bill Lumsden, you can just go to either Glenmorangie or Ardbeg's website, or search his name on YouTube. His interviews are both highly informative and really hilarious. Also, you could just try one of his bottles and let them speak for themselves. There are excellent whiskeys out there from both distilleries, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy them. Thank you, Whiskey Wizard, and back to you.
Well, that was fantastic and fascinating, to say the least. I can only expect that Dr. Bill will have more up his sleeve as he continues to work his magic up there at Glenmorangie. Maybe we can do some distillery series in the future where we might talk a bit more about all the things they're doing there in Taine. This is Douglas Dunbar, the Whiskey Wizard for the Whiskey Roundtable. Cheers, Slàinte. And since Dr. Bill is not the only one that can do some magic, I will say cheers, Slàinte again, and back to the live show.